Likenesses. 1981. When they found Leona's body, it was curled about an old grey cat, also curled and stiff. The funeral director's assistant, who did all the dirty work with the fluids and convex plastics to keep skin from sagging, while the funeral director, the artist he called himself, fussed with lipstick and wigs and hands folded just right, said he'd never had such a hard time prying two bodies apart, said he'd almost given up and buried them together. But of course one can't find a casket shaped like that. He was telling his cronies at the bar after work, and they all laughed to hear how the cat's stiff paws would not let go of the human hand. "The thing that gets me is how they must have died at the same damn time," he said, and drank his whiskey dry. "That's some crazy bond." Mama and Papa, 1910. Mama was born Katerina Wiggits of the original Canton Schwyz Wiggits, who boasted a family crest of gold wheat on a field of blue. If she had been a joyous child, nobody in America knew, for her unhappiness blossomed with her youth, when she was unceremoniously shipped off to distant relatives after her father married a younger woman to replace her dead mother, the young wife having no use for her predecessor's children. At age 20, Mama found herself working as a seamstress in St. Louis, where she met Albert Bénon, another Swiss, but from the other side. He spoke no German and she no French. Their common language was their adopted tongue of English. Papa worked as a mechanic on the Ford Model T for much of Leona's childhood, first in St. Louis, then in San Francisco. Not the factory type. Papa managed always to steer clear of the assembly line, working independently as a mechanic who fixed cars for the youngsters who'd grown up wanting them, not making them. Having apprenticed in Geneva in the early days of the internal combustion engine, he was a tinkerer at heart. If he had not the temperament, nor genius, nor entrepreneurial spirit for Ford or Benz, he shared with them a great facility for putting things together and taking them apart, as well as a soft spot for the new and ingenious, which found expression in his trade of mechanics and his hobby of photography. In Leona's photograph of them, Mama dwarfs Papa, whose head is nearly level with, and not quite as big as, her enormous breasts. Dressed in calico, she seems painfully aware of how ludicrous they must appear in the eyes of posterity, and hence refuses to meet our gaze. She stares off camera and away from her husband. For his own part, Papa enjoyed posing for pictures almost as much as he loved taking them. Hence he looks directly into the camera, seeming almost to delight in his new wife's embarrassment. The result is a portrait of a couple whose eyes' trajectories form an acute angle, symbolic of their married life. Papa, 1923. Papa left on his first solo sojourn when Leona was 13. She cherished the photograph he sent, in which a swashbuckling Papa wearing tilted hat and lace-up boots is surrounded by otherworldly trees with knotted flower arms that stretch to the sky, on the back of which he wrote, 6 November 1923, Mojave Desert, love Papa. Leona felt not the least resentment towards him for leaving. Mama felt enough for the two of them, and rather admired the rugged jauntiness of his likeness, as well as the cleverness of the timer camera and the hand-built automobile, which, though they did not make it into the frame, add greatly to the charming picture of independence. As the 20s roared along, Papa spent less and less time in San Francisco, so that when the crash of 29 hit, his absence was more fixed than was his presence. Sporadic letters wrapped around small bundles of cash had also grown scarce, then vanished altogether. But by then Leona was a woman. She took jobs cleaning Nob Hill houses to support the family, which also included her little brother, Arthur, who, being 8 years her junior, was almost more son than brother. Mama had a tyrannical disposition, which, if it were not for Leona's being her equal as a workhorse on the one hand and impervious to black moods on the other, would have made the double mother household unbearable. As it was, the two balanced each other out and raised Arthur with much discipline and coddling, respectively. Arthur rewarded their ministrations by being the first in their family and their acquaintances to go to university. Good at math and eager to travel the world like Papa, Arthur studied mining, a subject which since the gold rush days had become a marvel of science and engineering, while it maintained its adventuring mystique. Alcidos and Leona, 1939. Working and helping Mama to raise Arthur had left Leona no time for socializing or finding a husband until Arthur went to work in the Nevada City mines and began sending money home. By then she was no longer young, nearly 30. So of course she thought herself very lucky when she found Alcidos at the William Tell, where they offered Swiss fare and nightly dancing. Alcidos Godin, of French-Canadian ancestry, was born with surname Godin, but followed in the footsteps of several of his 12 elder siblings by adding the additional O in order to avoid the unfortunate American pronunciation Godin. A construction worker who followed WPA jobs from Minnesota to San Francisco, Alcidos proved a perfect gentleman and a brave worker too. He'd helped build the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, as well as its younger and more splendid sister span, which had opened just before Leona and he met. Alcidos would have good, if dangerous, work for years to come. Best of all, he also loved to dance and wanted lots of children. Unlike the portrait of Mama and Papa, the photograph Alcidos and Leona had taken at the Golden Gate International Exposition shows two bright-eyed smiling faces, serene and confident in their future happiness together. Thus, as you might imagine, the first time Alcidos returned, Leona did not recognize him. She was so big, the baby due any day, that she mistook him for an angel. She had been resting for a moment on the little back porch of their new home in Visitation Valley when the hummingbird flew to her and hovered, drenched in sunlight. Her heart sang with joy. The baby would be swaddled in love and happiness as voluminous as any babe could want. It was not long after that, friends of Alcidos, who had been working on the job with him and his foreman, knocked on her door. The darkness that encompassed them chilled her. It was an unthinking certainty of doom. Probably the foreman spoke first, clutching his hat. "How sorry we are to have to bring you this sad, very, very sad, dreadful news, especially as you are in your condition, Mrs. Godin. We are not sure how it happened." He did not want to say it right out. He wanted to prepare her. Strangely, she was certainly the calm one. She asked, "My husband has been hurt?" The hesitation and furtive glances told her what they could not say. "Alcidos is dead," she whispered to herself or them. It did not matter. They were relieved. They continued as if it had been one of them that had braved the evil words. Leona let them prattle on, condolences and regrets piling atop one another, a rubble heap as tall as at one of their construction sites. Others, tongue-tied or talkative, came and went, the parlor filled with the sounds and scents of birth and death. Gifts of baby booties and tiny crocheted hats sat alongside impossibly dense clusters of flowers and baked goods. Cards of happy congratulations mingled with those pronouncing sorrow. Mama took care of her in the 4 days between death and birth and remained with her thereafter. Alcidos Godin Jr., Alcy, was born while his father rumbled away on an eastbound train. His family wanted to bury him in their Minnesota plot. Leona was too shocked by the first loss to protest the second, but it developed that his body was inconsequential. Alcy, 1942. Alcy's first years passed while the Second World War raged in Europe, and many in Visitation Valley, which resembled more closely the ranch it had once been than the rest of San Francisco, went back to their roots to survive. One day Mama came home with a crate of chickens, and soon thereafter bartered eggs for goat's milk from the neighbors across the fence. In this way, Alcy grew up chasing chickens and looking with his hand-me-down brass-button coat and handmade knit cap, just like Papa as a boy, said Arthur, chuckling, and took a picture of the funny little old-world child. When she saw the photograph, Leona thought how her son had been born in mourning and was being raised in calamity, but that somehow his cheeks remained flushed with a happy rosy glow. It was around then that Leona recognized her husband in the figure of a chicken. He had not been one of those Mama brought home, but rather sauntered into their yard from nowhere, it seemed, and made himself right at home, laying more eggs than the other three together. Leona couldn't say for certain when she recognized the chicken as her beloved husband exactly, but when it came to her, she'd known it as a fact. She'd known that her dear Alcidos hovered near, watching over them almost from the moment her son had been born. But now it appeared to her as a comforting and certain truth, as if an unseen hand gathered in all that was good and kept everything else out. From her moment of revelation, Leona lived with the Father and the Son in a Trinitarian paradise, while Mama hung in the background like a reliable, if disagreeable clock. Alcy, 1958. After the chicken, Alcidos returned as a dog, actually 2 dogs. Alcy found the first on the street on his way home from school. The pup grew monstrous in size and in his devotion to Elsie. For a few years he was bigger than the boy, and the two were inseparable. The second, a spotted brown runt, Leona herself found sniffing around in her front stoop petunias. Leona realized that although Alcidos wanted to watch over his son, he understood that the boy had become a young man whose every care was not about pups. It was Leona who mostly took care of the second dog, and she was grateful that it was small, almost no trouble at all. Her husband seemed to be conforming to their ever-changing situation. During high school, Alcy, or as he preferred Al, was hardly home. When he did come home, he merely patted the dog as he went to his room and on his way back out again. He was very popular in school, a yell leader surrounded by other fine young men and a bevy of pretty cheerleaders. He told her, "Yell leaders are as popular as football players, but without the bruises." In his graduation picture, he wears a sweet smile and glasses that enlarge his hazel eyes, twinkling with the touch of the devil, just like Papa. Alcy graduated from SF State with a degree in sociology and, after bouncing around the city with a few odd jobs, decided to join the military. Leona could not be surprised. The wanderlust was in his blood, but her future loneliness and uselessness blanketed her in a black fog. She forced herself to play a part, acting happy, although her heart was breaking. A handsome young officer off to see the world, she did not want to dampen his excitement. On the day of his departure, his taxi arrived, and she kissed him goodbye. When he was truly gone, she crawled back into bed and indulged in self-pity for the first and only time in her life. All were gone, and it was February. The previous February had seen the death of Mama. In February 23 years earlier, her husband had died and her son had been born. How many anniversaries can a person cram into one dark month? She lay in her tiny, creaky bed and cried until she could not cry anymore. She watched the ceiling turn gold to black. Looking back on that day with no little shame, she thought perhaps she had feared her husband would leave too. That night, Alcidos visited her as a man. He walked into their room just like he had done in the short, precious year they'd had together so long ago, and lay down next to her. She nestled into him, and he folded her into his warmth. They did not talk for a long time, and when they did, it was in whispered, breathless phrases, punctuated by sweet kisses. He told her how he'd been walking the roof of the Rinkin Annex, whistling a silly medley of popular baby tunes. "You must have been a beautiful baby." "Yes, sir, that's my baby," when my baby smiles at me, and thinking of his wife, glowing with their baby inside her. I was in bliss over the idea of having 2 babies to love when my foot stepped onto a loose board in the scaffolding. Heaven knows how many times I'd stepped on just such rickety things before and not gone tumbling over the side like a klutz. I worked on the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay Bridge, and it was a post office on Market Street that did me in. He chuckled, and Leona let out a little laugh that turned right into a sob. He continued, "That time I went flying because my mind was not on my work, but on my love. Do not cry, my darling." He hugged her tighter. "It was meant to be. You see, I have been able to stay with you and our boy all these years. I have always been here, whether or not you have recognized me. Will you go overseas with Elsie? I will be with you forever." When Leona woke the next morning, her eyes were burning, and she felt bereft of her husband all over again. But then she washed her face and bustled about the house, cleaning and humming those happy songs from between the wars. That evening, when she opened her kitchen door onto the back porch, a tabby cat came running in, meowing. She laughed and picked him up and kissed him on the head. Then she opened a can of tuna for him. That began the age of the cats. Elsie and Demi, 1968. Elsie returned home to San Francisco, which she had done periodically through the years, but this time it was for a purpose. He planned to get hitched. He had received a promotion, and after 5 wild years in the Far East, would be living on a base in Virginia, surrounded by families. He told his mother, "A wife is vital in a place like that. Everyone will be married. A nice girl will keep me out of trouble." He took the old high school sweetheart, whose name was Demi, out a few times, then got drunk one afternoon and called her at the Emporium where she sold cosmetics. Leona almost dropped the dish she was drying when she heard him say, "Do you have a dowry?" "A dowry, yes. How much will your father give me for you?" The wry smile could be heard in his voice, and the woman seemed to understand he was joking, for Leona could hear her laughter through the phone line before she hung up. She called him back, though, and they went for dinner that night. Elsie returned home with her and announced to his mother that they would drive to Reno on the weekend to hide the knot. "You're eloping? Can't we at least have a party?" "There's no time, Ma. I ship out next week. When we get settled, we'll fly you out." In their wedding portrait, Demi wears a white lace mini dress with a hem appropriately short for the times and startlingly prophetic regarding their marriage. The bride appears shy, perhaps embarrassed by the brevity of the dress and the recent courtship, while Elsie looks like a rooster preparing to crow. Michelle, 1976. After 5 years of military sojourning in the creation of a girl child, they separated. Elsie called to say that the marriage was kaput. It was a distant event since they were stationed in Holland, but still Leona felt it to be dreadful. The slow dissolution of her parents' union by inherent unsuitability, the abrupt termination of her own by tragedy, and now the divorce of her son, with marriages in her family under some kind of curse. No, she decided, Alcidos and she were different, for their love tethered them despite universal laws. One wonderful repercussion resulted from the breakup. The wife returned to San Francisco, bringing with her the granddaughter. For that, Leona was grateful. Michelle, that was her granddaughter's name, was as clever and eager to please as Elsie at her age, and it was a joy to have her around. Whenever she visited, she would ask, "Where's Kitty?" and would poke around until she found him. Leona had named all the kitties Kitty so as not to slip up and call them by her dead husband's name. It caused people concern for her. Michelle loved to run around the house, trailing string for the cat to chase. Leona chuckled at the way Alcidos teased his granddaughter. He clutched the string and jumped and pounced. Then, just as the little girl ran down the hallway, he pretended to lose interest so that she was forced to peer around the corner to see where he was. Leona had a camera of her own now, a Polaroid instant that her son had given her, and managed once to catch that sweetly expectant expression. After the image emerged, Michelle asked if she could put it up on the mantel with the other photographs, which stood like sentinels in little gilded frames. 1981. Her last cat grew all white about the whiskers while he waited patiently, watching as Leona taught Michelle how to make Christmas ornaments, pancakes, and apple-head dolls. The little girl grew, but had not yet reached an age to leave her grandmother when her grandmother left her. One evening, Leona lay on the couch, curled about the cat curled about her hand, when she whispered into one furry ear, "Please, Alcidos, do not leave me again. Take me with you this time." Above on the mantel, the family photographs would remain, innocent of death, the likenesses nearly as slender as the life lying coiled before them.